Until very recently, I, 22 and female, was doing door-to-door election work, getting people registered to vote, helping them get out to the polls, etc. I had to quit though, because I was made acutely aware of just how easily I could end up being put in a very dangerous situation. At my job, we all got driven out in a van to different areas and dropped off alone for about 8 hours until we all got picked back up at the same spot. We each carried an iPad with a list of addresses and the names of people living at those houses, as well as their age and gender. Generally, we had an okay idea of whether or not the person who answered the door was the person we were actually looking for. Quite often though, a family member would answer or a friend or something, then go and get the person I was actually trying to speak with. So having a random person answer the door wasn't very unusual at all. This day was also a particularly cold day as well. It was around 8 p.m., so it was already very dark out. Because of this, when this guy in his mid to late 20s asked me to step inside for a moment while he went to go get his father, who is the actual person I was looking for, I did feel a bit uneasy, but I also didn't want to be rude. Especially because he was being so nice, asking me if I needed water or something to eat or anything. After I stepped inside though, he closed the door, saying he didn't want to let the heat out. Then he said he was going to get his father from the kitchen. While I was waiting for them to come back, I stepped a bit further in away from the door so I could pet his dog, who was acting very friendly with me. All of a sudden though, as I leaned down to pet it, I realized the guy was now standing right behind me, in between me and the door. There was a hallway running perpendicular to the direction of the front room that ended close to the front door, if that makes sense, so I guess he snuck around. This guy then told me he had been mistaken. His dad wasn't actually at home. My brain froze for a couple of minutes. I just stood there staring at him, unable to understand what was happening. The man began to approach me, asking very personal questions. He began trying to intimidate me, and his body language was much more forceful and brazen than it had been just a few seconds prior. I'm 5'8" and around 120 pounds, so I'm not tiny at all. This was a big fucking guy though. He was right in the middle of talking about how dangerous it was for a nice girl like me to be out by myself at night, and how I should really be more careful next time, when suddenly my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway, and pretended like I knew who this was, and that they were working with me. It turned out though that the number was actually a telemarketer. I honestly have never been happier to get a call from anyone as I did at that moment. As I was on the phone with this robocall, I mentioned the address I was at and thanked them for being on their way already. Immediately, the guy stepped to the side and tried to laugh it off. He even told me to remember what he just said about being safe out there. Honestly, I think I would have been attacked if I hadn't gotten that spam call at that exact moment. The scariest thing to me though was realizing later that he'd probably pretended to go look for his father out of my line of sight so he could go grab a weapon or something. Otherwise, why wouldn't he just grab me as soon as I stupidly stepped inside? I've always been real good friends with one of my cousins, Cole, who's around the same age I am. The two of us were not quite inseparable, but we always did get along very well together. We were often found together as well, both in school and outside of it. When we were about 12 years old and in the 6th grade, I was hanging out with Cole on a Friday afternoon, around the later part of May. We were really psyched for the start of the weekend. We'd wound up at his house since he didn't live too far away from me. At one point, my mom called to say that our grandpa was in the hospital. While the issue with our grandpa wasn't expected to be life-threatening, he was being kept in the hospital overnight for observation. So both my parents and Cole's were planning on staying with him and Grandma at the hospital, since my mom and her sister were the two of their siblings who lived close by. Because of this, I was told I was being given the okay to stay at Cole's house for the night. Cole's 15-year-old brother Hunter was going to be in charge while our parents were out. Well, that was just fine with us. I got along well enough with Hunter, and he was never really the bossy older brother/cousin that some of my friends said they had to put up with. We ordered out for a pizza and enjoyed goofing off as boys that age tend to do. Around 9 or so, there was a knock at the front door, and Cole went to answer it. I was a bit curious as to who it could be at this time of night, and I watched from a ways back. At the door, there were two older guys. They said they were with the city, and that they were investigating reports about the water pressure supposedly being bad in this neighborhood. They asked Cole if his parents were home. Cole said they were unavailable at the moment, which is what we had always been told to say to strangers if our parents weren't actually home. The men then started asking a bunch of questions about how the water pressure was in the house and if they could come inside quickly to check. Hunter politely told the guys that the water pressure was just fine and perhaps they should move on to check on other homes in the neighborhood. The men seemed very reluctant to leave, but eventually turned around and walked away after Hunter started to close the door. Well, after the door was shut, we looked at each other and just shrugged. We didn't really think too much of it after that though, and went right back to goofing off. Eventually, we decided to go to bed. Cole and Hunter shared a bedroom, and we all agreed that I'd sleep in there with them, rather than me hitting the sack on the couch or something like that. We wanted to talk while we fell asleep after all. Hunter grabbed a sleeping bag out of their camping supplies for me. When we got into their bedroom, we all stripped down to our briefs. I remember Cole had mentioned to me once a while back that they had started sleeping in just their underwear. Since I hadn't originally planned on staying the night, I hadn't brought anything with me from home as far as overnight stuff. Since I wasn't in the mood to sleep in my clothes, I stripped down as well, although I did feel a bit embarrassed, even though we were all guys there and I knew they wouldn't say anything or be judgmental. They climbed into their beds and I quickly crawled into the sleeping bag. After talking for a while about random things, we eventually fell asleep. Early the next morning, I got up because I had to pee. I quietly snuck out of the sleeping bag and went and did my business in the bathroom. On my way back though, I could hear something weird going on in the family room, which was on the opposite end of the house from the bedrooms and the particular bathroom I was using. At first, I didn't really pay much attention to this noise. I mean, it must be either Cole or Hunter, right? That was until I got back to the bedroom and realized that both of them were still fast asleep. Trying my best not to panic, I woke them both up and told them I thought someone was in the house. They quietly followed along behind me. The moment we walked into the family room, we could see the two men from the night before were there, and it was rather clear they were robbing the place. One of them noticed us and started moving towards us as he pulled out a wicked-looking knife. All three of us promptly raced to the front door and somehow managed to get it unlocked and open before he reached us. We fled outside. As fate would have it, a cop happened to be driving by in that exact moment. We very quickly flagged him down and told him about the two men in the house. The cop called for backup, and within a couple of minutes, several other cops arrived. They then proceeded to enter the house. After some searching, they caught the two men red-handed. The cops figured out they must have entered from a window in the laundry room that had a broken latch. They probably targeted our house because while it wasn't empty, they realized there were no adults there, and that 3 children on their own could be very easily dealt with. To add insult to injury, while we were waiting outside as the cops searched the house, some of the neighbors came out to see what the commotion was about. This included some kids who went to the same school as Cole and I, including a few who were in our 6th grade class with us. It was during that time that the 3 of us realized we'd never gotten the chance to get dressed. So, just like in the stereotypical nightmare, we had to stand outside in full view of everyone in just our briefs for what seemed like forever, before we were finally allowed back inside. Needless to say, when we went back to school on Monday, Cole and I had to put up with more than our fair share of snickering, stares, and ribbing for many weeks, until school finally ended for the summer. This happened when I was 17 years old. I'd just gotten my car a few months before this. I was driving home from work, and while on a long road with nothing but trees on both sides, I was about 20 minutes away from my house. While driving, blasting my music, I suddenly saw a car coming at me on the wrong side of the road. I tried my best to swerve away, but I just couldn't do it in time, and the person slammed into me. Fortunately, they weren't going very fast, so I ended up not getting hurt very much. Honestly, I was more so upset because I knew my mom would be fucking pissed if she found out I crashed my car already. I knew she wouldn't believe me either if I told her that this person had been driving on the wrong side of the road. Well, as you might imagine, I hopped out of my car to confront this person, knowing this was not my fault at all. While I was walking to his car, this man suddenly opened the door and sprinted out into the woods. I chased after him for 5 minutes before getting scared, keeping in mind that it was 8 p.m., so it was very dark out. The last thing I wanted to do was run out into these dark, thick woods alone at night. I walked back to my car, extremely pissed off that this man had ran away before I could even get his information. I got back in my car, but now my car wouldn't start at all. It was a pretty old car as a hand-me-down, so I was even more pissed off now. It would seem I had no choice but to walk the rest of the way home. After about 2 minutes of walking, I saw a pickup truck coming up closer to me. The person stopped right by me and asked me something. "Hey, I saw that crash back there. I'm guessing that's your car?" "Yeah, it is. Some guy driving on the wrong side of the road slammed into me and ran off into the woods." "What the fuck? That's so weird. Would you like me to drive you home?" I replied, very excited. "Yes, please." I got into his truck and told him my address as he drove off. He told me it was very dangerous to be walking alone in these parts at night. I didn't really have a choice though. My car just wouldn't start at all. As soon as he heard this, he didn't reply. He just peeked at me out of the corner of his eye and smiled. It creeped me out a lot, but I didn't really think anything of it. After all, this guy was just some old man. Plus, I was really grateful I wouldn't have to walk the rest of the way home. As we continued to drive on though, I noticed that he passed the exit to get back onto the main road. Excuse me, sir, you just passed the exit." "Oh, I know. We're just gonna have to stop somewhere real quick." At this point, I got this gut feeling that I should not be here. I knew I'd made a huge mistake getting into this guy's car. After a few minutes of driving, he stopped at a gas station and went inside the store that connected to it. I saw his phone on the dashboard and sneakily picked it up. Thank God it didn't have a passcode, so I called my mom to come pick me up. I didn't have a phone at the time. As I was looking at his phone, I idly noticed that he had 2 missed messages. I checked them out of curiosity. Once I did, my heart stopped in its place. The missed messages were from a contact named Davey. "Hey, I just hit him. I ran off into the woods. Come right now." Then it all clicked in my mind. That man had hit me on purpose and texted this old man to come pick me up. I didn't waste a single second. I took his phone and booked it out of there. As soon as I started running, I could hear the old man shouting behind me, "Hey, he's running!" I ran even faster after hearing this. I eventually made it to the main road and felt a bit more safe because there were other cars and streetlights around. After what felt like hours of running, I made it to my mom's house, yelling to let me in while banging on the door. She opened it and saw my face was pale and took me in. She hugged me while I explained everything. In that moment, I realized that now this old man had my address, as I'd told him everything. I wanted to punch myself in the face as hard as I could, honestly. My mom and I locked all the doors and windows and then called the police right away. A few days later, no one showed up at the house, but we did hear on the news that the 2 people were a father and son duo who would crash into people's cars on purpose, then run into the woods. Once the people stopped following, he would text the dad telling them that he was in the woods and signaling for the dad to come offer them a ride. Once they said yes, they would kidnap these people. It turns out that this duo had raped and murdered several men and women. They were arrested for sexual assault, kidnapping, and murder. Still, to this day, I wonder what they would have done to me if I had never just happened to check that phone. This story takes place in North Italy, way back in 2014. It was early September, I believe. A friend of mine proposed me to take a short hike into the woods near his town. Obviously, I agreed since I liked hiking in the nature. We prepared our backpacks, grabbed up some food, and drove out to the place. My friend knew the area very well, so we didn't take a map with us. We didn't have flashlights either, since we'd planned to return to the car in just a few hours, and in early September, daylight would last pretty long around these parts. As we got deeper into those woods, we saw plenty of beautiful spots, small rivers, and even a pair of caves that we explored as well. They were pretty small in all honesty and only had one chamber though. We had lunch and proceeded to follow a trail into a deeply wooded area. After around half an hour or so, we arrived to a pretty large clearing. And here comes the scary part. We noticed immediately that in this clearing there were around 4 to 5 people, all normally dressed. They seemed to be simply talking and laughing. No satanic cults, dreadful chants, or praying in a circle or whatever else. Honestly, just super ordinary looking people, just like me and my friend, all talking to each other. They obviously saw us too, since the clearing had no trees or rocks to cover the view, and we couldn't avoid that. The trail, after a deep curve, immediately ended in the clearing and proceeded to the other side of it. We called out, approaching them, since they were in the middle of the track. "Hey there guys, what's up?" They didn't answer back. They all stared at us in unison, not saying a single word. This obviously launched a huge red flag. We stopped too, and I looked over to my mate. He looked back at me very concerned. Hey guys, everything alright?" No answers. I started to feel uneasy, so we decided to just turn around and go back to the car. As soon as we moved back though, we realized that they'd all started to follow us. As we looked behind us, we yelled back to them, "Hey, why are you guys following us? Did we do something wrong?" Yeah, we were still pretty young and dumb. In those kinds of situations, you probably should run immediately the fuck out of there. No answer, once again. Obviously, we started to walk faster and tried to get off the trail. Another pretty dumb choice, but again, my friend knew the area very well. Even going off trail though, no matter how deep into the woods we would go, they were always around 15 meters behind us. We started to panic. We looked to each other again and agreed we needed to get out of there as soon as possible. As soon as we began to run, we heard them all begin running in unison as well. This obviously made us freak out, and we made our best move to put more distance between us and them. Another thing that made me start to panic was that I knew we were around 40 minutes away from the car at this point, in a very isolated area. I thought we were very obviously hopeless. At a certain point though, when we were about halfway back, we noticed that they had started to slow down and weren't as close behind us anymore. We thought that maybe, and luckily, we'd managed to make them lose our tracks. The area, as said, was in a heavily wooded area and had plenty of slopes as well. It was easy to get lost if you were not used to it. We hid behind this thick bush and tried our best to listen. No footsteps or voices. We took a deep breath and managed to return to the car, trying our best to be as silent as possible. We jumped in and raced the fuck out of there. But it doesn't end there. As we left the woods on the main road, we saw coming from a secondary road another car pull in behind us. It was those same people, following us once again. Surely they had never lost our tracks at all while we were returning to the car. We were sure they were the same people, since they were basically tailgating us, and the area was very rarely visited. There were absolutely zero cars except for my friend's. Their car also had no plates either. We drove down to my friend's town, avoiding his house altogether, taking every country road, but every turn we made, they did as well. As we reached the town's ingress, they made a sudden U-turn and returned back to the woods direction. We were fucking terrified and immediately called the police. We also informed the people that were in the small town square as they approached us, since me and my friend were basically sobbing as we got out of the car. They did check the area out, but no evidence of activity came up in the following hours. They never showed up anymore in the following days either. We became paranoid for some weeks to even get out of our houses. This experience is why I took a break from hiking for about 4 years. I have no idea who those guys were or why they acted like this, but that experience almost gave me PTSD. It was terrifying. And fun fact, this experience happened in broad daylight too. How eerie. This happened about a year ago to me and my husband. It was our 10th anniversary, so we decided to go camping, just the two of us. And of course our dog as well. There's a big national park/camping area near where we live, a little bit less than an hour's drive away. That was where we were going to be heading. It was basically a big forest with many small lakes, ponds, trails, and camping sites around. It was a pretty popular place during the summer, but we still saw some people even though it was late September and the weather was quite cold. We found a good spot right next to a lake to set up our camp. It was a really beautiful day out, so we wanted to hike a bit into the forest. There was a nice long path that was going around the lake where we had set up our camp, so we chose to head that way. The lake was quite small, and there was another camping site by it as well. You could see there from our camp, and from there you could see our camp. They were about on the opposite sides of the lake. We walked past the other camp and saw a man there all alone, just standing and staring at us. He didn't even answer when we greeted him. He was maybe in his late 20s, around the same age as us, I believe. I thought at that point that maybe the man was just shy and perhaps a little bit weird. He had a small tent set up and some other stuff strewn around the place, so I figured he must have been there for a long while. We just continued on walking and didn't really think much of the encounter. Eventually, we got back to our camp and started to set up our tent before it got too dark. We made some wood by the fire and just sat there enjoying the peace. All of a sudden though, our dog starts barking like crazy. She was tied to a long wire around a tree. Immediately, we realized she wasn't just being paranoid. There really was something in the woods, and it was close by. It had been very dark for hours at this point. We took the dog to a leash, and my husband started to look around with his bright headlamp. Our dog started going even crazier. We were confused. Surely this was some kind of an animal, perhaps a bear or a moose, but we couldn't understand why it wasn't scared of us and why it would not run away. My husband went ahead to the path that led to the other camp. Right when he got to it though, which was just 10 meters away from our camp, he saw something on the ground. I told him to go check out what it was and followed along with our dog. He suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. There's a person is there laying on the ground. The first thing I thought was that maybe they were hurt or perhaps dead or something. They just laid there not moving at all, facing the ground. Sir, are you okay? Are you hurt? The person immediately stood straight up from the ground. Turned out it was that exact same guy from the other camp. It seemed he was very scared of our dog and told me not to let her near him. I was kind of relieved, honestly, that it wasn't some bear that was going to eat us. I soon learned, though, that a bear might have been far less scary than this guy. After he stood up, he just walked right to our campfire and sat down. My husband asked him multiple times why he was sneaking around in the dark forest without any light, but he refused to answer. We laughed a bit and told him how we thought he was a damn bear or some shit, but he didn't do anything. He just stared deeply into the fire. His right leg was soaking wet. He'd probably stepped off the path and dipped it in the lake on his way to our camp. He sat there for 30 minutes, not saying a single word. He also clearly wanted to observe where our dog was at all times. I saw he had a knife hanging from his belt, but I guess that's not that weird when you live in the woods. Every few minutes or so, he would put his hand into his pocket and just peek out whatever was in there. Kinda like how someone would check the time on their phone without taking it out from their pocket, but it definitely was not a phone in there. I started to feel very uncomfortable and anxious. After another 30 minutes had passed, the man suddenly stood up and mumbled something about going back to his own camp. He walked off into the dark. He never gave us an explanation of why he had come or why he was stalking us in the dark. He also tried very hard not to be seen when we found him. When I thought he was far enough away, I told my husband there was no way I was sleeping there that night. The biggest nope ever. Fortunately for me, he agreed right away and said that guy would probably come back when we were sleeping. I just wanted to leave ASAP, so my husband started packing things up. I was guarding and looking around with a light to see if the man would come back. Just when we had almost gotten all of our stuff into the car, I saw a very brief flash of light on the path from the man's camp to ours. The man was coming back. Maybe he thought we'd just gone to sleep because he couldn't see our campfire anymore. As soon as we noticed this, we just hopped in the car and left real quick. I don't know if we overreacted maybe, but I had a very bad feeling about this guy. Who crawls around in a dark, wet forest alone at night just to stalk some strangers? What would he have done if our dog hadn't heard him? What were his motives? Maybe to stab us to death when we were sleeping? I don't know, and I didn't want to stay there to find out. I'm just glad we did have our dog with us. There's a very good chance she saved our lives that night. This happened on Saturday. My girlfriend Tess, my puppy Jack, and I were all getting ready for a road trip. We were planning on meeting some friends at their house, then starting the trip together from there. On our way to their house though, around 11 a.m., a white car with all tinted windows cut us off, then brake checked us close enough that I had to slam the brakes and swerve to avoid an accident. In my immediate fury, I honked and flipped the driver off. I wish I hadn't done this. Immediately, the driver rolled down his window and waved his hand over. He slowed down to go back to the other lane so that our cars were parallel to one another. The driver was now gesturing wildly and yelling at us while we continued driving down the avenue. I proceeded to try and calm him down, but when that didn't work, I just tried to ignore him and continue driving. He continued to drive right next to us. Eventually, I tried speeding up. He revved in front of me and tried brake checking me again. At this point, I swerved to the other lane, and he again slowed down to match my speed. He was still gesturing and screaming while I tried to ignore him. Suddenly, he reached into his lap, and I noticed he was holding a glass bottle. He threw it, and it shattered on the side of my vehicle. Tess was hysterical at this point. The pup was hiding under the passenger seat. I went into adrenaline mode and tried turning into different streets as the chase then ensued. He was following close behind me and began throwing other things that would slam against my back window. I told Tess to call the police as we sped down a 2-lane street and up a hill. She called 911 as I came to a stoplight at the top of the hill. The guy chasing us slowed down to a stop behind us. All of a sudden, he hopped out of his vehicle. In my rearview mirror, I could see him reach back into his car and grab something, then shove it into his shorts. He began walking toward my side of the car as the car in front of me drove away. I noped the fuck out of there. I slammed the gas and turned into the next avenue. Within only a minute though, the man had caught back up to us. I was now on speaker with 911, explaining the situation and giving them details of his car and appearance. Tess was crying as we sped down a busy avenue, weaving in between cars at 20 above the speed limit. I was updating the 911 lady with where we were, and she told me to drive to the station. At the next red light, the man was now yelling audibly, "Do we have a problem? Don't fucking flip me off!" I was trying to gesture that everything was alright. He was still trying to get me out of the car though. The light was still red. He again hopped out of his vehicle. I floored it through the red light. He continued to chase me as I made my way toward the police station. We were now accelerating and brake checking each other as he tried to drive me off the road. I made gestures that he should continue following, hoping to get him to the station. About a block from the police, we get stuck at a busy intersection. There were many cars around as he again walked up to my car. This time I was boxed in, and Tess was panicking. I was looking for any escape options, but there were none left. The drivers around us noticed, and many pulled their windows up and locked their doors. The man came right up to my window, slapped it with his palm, and asked one more time if there was a problem. I again adamantly said no. The 911 lady told me not to engage over the phone speaker. The man simply said, "Good." He got back into his car and sped away. 20 minutes into this horrible car chase experience, we ended up meeting with the cops. They said there was nothing they could do, even though I updated them with more details of his direction and where he was last. Thankfully, after this, we were able to calm down and continue with our road trip.